One of the things that are really inspiring to me is when there's an overcoming situation from the underdog. And I feel like as believers, a lot of times we are in a position, maybe we feel in the world at large as underdogs. And we say that we're more than conquerors, but our mindset and our daily living, do we really believe that? Do we really understand that? Do we really walk in that? And I'm not saying that we live on mountaintops every day, because reality hits. However, we have to remember who we are, and we have to remember whose we are. First of all, David took all of his responsibilities very seriously. Here was David in a time where he was out in the field. That was a very despised job in that day and age. It wasn't highly esteemed, like, oh, look at the shepherd. I think it's hilarious. I love the story when the prophet Samuel comes to Jesse and says, show me all your boys, and he only brings, he doesn't bring all of them. He just didn't think that David was even qualifying for greatness. Go get that shepherd boy and bring him. So David was anointed, but David was just doing what his father had told him to do, the parameters that God had given him. And I don't feel constricted by parameters. I feel comforted by parameters a lot of times. During his time as a shepherd, he was a loving shepherd. He took care and protection and had provision for those sheep. I think that's a tough job. I think that's a lonely job. It was a despised job. I was thinking just a few weeks ago, I wonder if that was a job that the older brothers had even had. And maybe they would talk to David, yeah, I remember that job. I remember that stupid job. I remember that so stupid sheep. I think sometimes in ministry life, people maybe who have had our job might want to speak into it maybe in a not so good way, in a not so good light. Oh, I remember when I was youth pastor. Yeah, those kids. Instead of the heart of David that said, whatever God has given me, I'm going to tend and care and nurture with all my heart and take good care of it. David was also a faithful worshiper. He had a lot of alone time probably out there tending sheep. And instead of in isolation or in loneliness crying about it, he prayed and worshiped out in that field. And he worked his instrument, right? He was out there with his harp and lyre, whatever his instrument was. Well, maybe we don't have an instrument, so to say, like a piano or a guitar or something like that, but we have a heart and we have a voice. There are not a lot of people who are engaged in worship. And I think that they maybe get intimidated, well, I don't have a good voice. Worship is not about a voice. Worship is about heart. And I love corporate worship because my lousy voice gets blended in with everybody else and it sounds really fantastic. He was also a fierce warrior. I think we think of that slingshot like little toys, but in that day and age, a slingshot was a fierce weapon. The slingers could actually split hairs. They were that accurate. David, as a fierce warrior, he had practice with his weapon, and he had history with success. He had history killing a lion and a bear. And we say that in a phrase like, oh yeah, the lion and the bear. These are feats that this little boy did. And in God's seeing, that's another thing that I just love. Sometimes we feel that in places of obscurity, that nobody sees, there's going to be no room for advancement because, how do I punch through that glass ceiling? Or nobody's noticing. God sees. And we can't get discouraged when we're in obscurity, thinking, is this matter? Is anybody noticing? God is noticing and God is keeping score. That always makes me feel a lot better. In 1 Samuel 17, Goliath said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Goliath said this because he was a combat fighter. He fought hand to hand. There's 3 kinds of warfare that we do. There's hand-to-hand combat, and that's what Goliath was good at. There's the cavalry who ride in on the horses. And then there's the artillery, and that's what David was, the slingers and the archers. Verse 15 says, but David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So here is David. He's been anointed as king. Every once in a while, he gets called into the courts of Saul because a distressing spirit comes on. Well, David was right then known for his musicianship, known as a worshiper. He gets brought into the courts of the king, and every time the king is insane, David gets brought in. At the same time, every once in a while, he has to go back and tend his father's sheep. Do you ever feel like you're in that position? That there's some craziness that you have to deal with, and then in the middle of the craziness, you get called back to obscurity and loneliness. What kind of kingdom building is this? I think he must have been really confused at that time about this is what it means to be anointed and set apart. That I'm over here playing my little instrument trying to soothe the crazy, insane king, and then I leave that to go out and feed some sheep and round him up. Verse 26, then David spoke to the man who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine? And then he says the famous line, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? And I think that maybe the armies of Israel just got used to that negative chatter and the ramblings of the enemy. I think they just, every day, they were petrified, the Bible says. They were in terror of him. And here comes this David. He was sent by his father, a message there, to take care and to come to the front lines. He heard the voice of the enemy. And you know what? He had a fresh perspective on the scene. You know, he did not intend at all. Sometimes we think he's a little shepherd boy. He's got a little slingshot. And he pulled that stone back and he shot Goliath. It was amazing. No, you know what? He was a warrior. He was a worshiper. He was a faithful servant of the living God. He comes on the scene. He hears the taunting of the enemy to Israel's army, and he says, who is this guy? Hey, brothers, do you remember who we are? That we are trained, that we have God on our side? Who is this? And he had no intention, because what Goliath does then is says, hey, you come to me. And I think that's another place that we get in trouble, is that the enemy says, come on out to my war, and we'll fight my way. How did Goliath want to fight? Hand to hand. And you know what? The Bible has some strong instruction about not engaging with the enemy on his terms. David did not engage on the enemy's terms. David engaged on what he had practiced and what he knew, and on God's terms. 2 Corinthians 10 says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal or not fleshly, but they are mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. What kind of engagement are we wrestling with the enemy? And he is really happy when we get down and dirty in the mud with him. We're never meant to do hand-to-hand combat. This is our offensive weapon. So my friends, what situations are you facing today that the enemy is calling you out and saying, you're not going to win, you little loser? Who are you, you little person? That we would come and stand up and say, who are you, you uncircumcised Philistine? Who are you to be defying the armies of the living God? I think when the church rises up in that day and says, who are you? We will come against principalities of cities. I pray that we are encouraged to know that God's promises are true. His word is sure, that we can have all hope and trust that God is working things out for our good. We need to be mighty warriors, fierce worshipers, and faithful that God has intended us to do.